Je m'excuse de ne pas parler français. Mon français, c'est beaucoup mauvais. Alors, as has been said, I'm going to speak in English, so I apologize. Thank you very much for the introduction. And it's been a long day for all of you, so I will try to be short. But I will read a short statement to begin with, just to be precise. Then I will show some images. The statement that some of you may already know, but perhaps have not read. It's about European, because my presentation is going to be somehow metaphorical, and I want to make clear what I mean by a metaphor. The title was European Late Style and the Late Tasks of Europe. The old continent has performed a miracle, but its dream is now at risk. Although the 20th century was American and the 21st is going to be Asian, Europe has created a haven of prosperity, protection, and plurality which many envy, and which is based on a common culture of freedom, tolerance, and respect for diversity. We took for granted affluence, freedom, and peace. And in these troubled times, we see them menace both abroad and at home. Being part of an old world, considered decadent by many, Europe faces this crossroads overshadowed by the threat of decline, but also inspired by the wealth of its civilization. Some of its artists and writers have produced their most significant work during the old age, and perhaps their latest style can be used as a metaphor for the late tasks that our ancient continent faces. We have only to think of Titian, Turner, of Goya, Lebrun, or Le Corbusier, Beethoven, or Goethe. If these European masters produced late works which still move us, it is probably reasonable to expect our old continent can rise to the challenges ahead of our societies. In many fields, the field of heritage and cities, in that of the territory and landscape, and even in the wider concern with the planet, which involves issues like climate and energy, essential for the survival of humanity. The European dream is alive, but on life support. And it needs the combined effect of all to deliver the best fruits of its late style, dangerously dangling between senile and sublime. Well, just wait a little bit. I have more things to say. 3 weeks ago, I was here in the opening of the Foster exhibition. It was the 9th of May, and in the speeches by many authorities, nobody mentioned that it was the Day of Europe. Do you perhaps know that this is the Day of Europe? And do you know why it is the Day of Europe, the 9th of May? Because it was when Robert Schuman, not the composer, the politician, delivered the Schuman Declaration in 1950, which is, in the end, the basis of the Europe we have been privileged to grow. I was born in 1950, so somehow I feel I am a Schuman child, as many of us who have benefited from these extraordinary times in which we have not seen, the Europe of the First and Second World Wars. And you may say, well, there are still wars in Europe. Well, but they are not European wars. They are proxy wars on European territory. But on the whole, I am now 73. The 73 years have passed since the Schuman Declaration, and I think for Europe have been good years. But we must go back to the roots and read again the Schuman Declaration. Only 3 pages. It's very short. But the essence of our present state is there. And we must ask our politicians to go back to Schumann. In any case, you know, I was at the Pompidou with this exhibition homaging an 88-year-old architect, which is showing a magnificent show that, of course, I recommend all of you to visit. And only last week, I was in Athens, homaging another colleague, David Chipperfield, who received the Pritzker Prize happily, because he was also going to extend the National Archaeological Museum of Athens. And I felt that these two occasions, in the case of Foster, it was retrospective, it was looking back, but towards a work which is oriented towards the future. And in the case of Chipperfield, evidently is the one, probably the architect who has treated the past with most respect. So one was about the past of the future, the other one was about the future of the past. Somehow, occasions to celebrate. But this week in Madrid, I saw this image, which was announcing the performance of dancers. It's called Europa. And you see a wounded woman. Is this the symbol of Europe? Of course, we know what the reference is. The reference is to the rape of Europa. But this is not the image we want to use to keep in our minds when we discuss Europe. I want to go through a different story altogether. Titian was 70 when he painted this poesy for Philip II. Of course, Titian is one of the examples of late style. Vasari thought that Titian should have stopped painting when his eyesight was weaker and, in general, he had less strength. He said, you are going to destroy your reputation. But if Titian had stopped painting, we wouldn't benefit from the Danae, you know, from the fraying of Marsyas, or for the very last work, you know, the Pietà. So this late Titian is sometimes difficult to understand. I understand Vasari saying, do not destroy your reputation. But my God, what he did with lessened forces. But for instance, of course, Michelangelo was also someone whose late career is difficult to interpret. For instance, you see the Vittoria Colonna drawing and a later drawing of the Christ with these wavering lines. That they said, no, he was more spiritual, or he couldn't control his hand. You know, he was suffering from this impairment of the senses. If you take the Pietas, from the very first, the youthful Pietà, which is in the Vatican, and then Florentina, and up to the last one, you know, the Pietà Rondanini in Milan, which was left unfinished. You see that somehow, to our taste, the late Michelangelo is a shock. So it hits us. It's somehow deeper than even the youthful, amazingly gifted sculptor that he was. Or take Poussin. Bernini thought that Poussin should have stopped painting when his hands started to tremble. He said, no, 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 you mustn't paint anymore. But then we wouldn't have the storm, we wouldn't have Daphnis and Chloe, we would have lost an amazing wealth of beauty. Or someone else. Turner. Now you go to Turner to see the late career. You don't go to see the early works. But for Ruskin, the late works of Turner were incomprehensible. And he thought that they were not very good. Now we think the opposite. And in the late works, you have the snowstorm, or this one, rain, steam, and speed. We wouldn't have those if he had listened to Ruskin. And of course, I must mention Goya, because Goya, in the chapel of San Antonio de la Florida, reaches heights not only in its story, but also in the technique, which are difficult to equal, with these female angels, which still shock us. Or in the very late works that he did in the last part of his life, what are called the black paintings. So this very Goya made this drawing when he was an old man, saying, I'm still learning. He paints an old man with 2 buttons. They say, todavía aprendo, I still learn. This kind of attitude is one I want to bring here, remembering only a few others, not painters. In this case, Goethe, you know, the second Faust. Or, for instance, Beethoven, the Missa Solemnis, the last quartets. The last quartets, here it looks like Schoenberg. What's happened to Beethoven? Or, for instance, Finnegan's Wake by Joyce. Even those that have read Ulysses couldn't understand where he was going. Or the notebooks of someone that is better known for his almost mathematical works, Wittgenstein. And then come the notebooks, the blue notebooks, the brown notebooks. All of them, these writers, these philosophers, produce magnificent work in the last stretch of their own life. And of course, let me say a couple of things about architects, because we are with an architectural audience. Of course, we love the early Mies van der Rohe. We always cherish him. But what about the old man who goes back to Berlin, is too old to leave the car, to see, you know, the noise going up to produce this big span, the better big span of his career, completed 1 year before he died. Or Corbusier, of course, that we also love the first Corbusier. But the transit from La Cheminée to the objet à réaction poétique that would give, and Jean-Louis was discussing before, Ronchamp, which was not understood by anybody. Now it's a pilgrimage city. It's a pilgrimage place, but nobody understood Ronchamp. And Ronchamp was completed 10 years before he died. So in the last part of his career, he would produce more things. But Ronchamp is the parting work. So I won't bore you with many more things, but let me say that what I'm saying about late style, which I place here together with my Goya, saying I still learn, of course, was Adorno who first wrote about late style, referring to the last quartets of Beethoven. But this theme was taken out by Edward Said in the last part of his own life. He didn't see the book published because he died before completing it, and was published by the inheritors. Music and literature against the grain. By that meaning, you know, what elderly people do, and very often are misunderstood because they do not understand what they are doing. I've mentioned, with the case of the painters, so many critics of their own time that couldn't understand what was happening. But of course, there is also a French example, which I like very much, Antoine Compagnon, La vie derrière soi, which was his last course in the Institut de France, his last course. So in the same way that Edward Said was, he knew that death was close because he was ill. Also Antoine Compagnon knew that his academic career was going to a close, and then he wrote this book. He wrote this book, which are his lessons in his last course, La vie derrière soi. Or Philippe Somme, about elderly artists and the difficulties they establish. It's not easy to discuss them, and some did it beautifully. Of course, let me say something about the image used by Compagnon or the editors to present the work. You know, it's a Ricci painting which shows the dawn. It's a mythical story in which Dawn falls in love with a youth and gets from Zeus. He gives them to him, who is immortal. He would never die, but he forgets to ask for he'll never grow old. And now you find here the nymph and the lover, which will never die, but he's getting more and more old and less attractive. Of course, this is something which is interesting because, of course, the dawn is the sunrise. No? And we in Europe, we do not know whether these colors that we see far away are a sunrise or a sunset. Many think, no, Europe is in a sunset. It's in collapse. Politically, economically, demographically, you have no hope. You know, yeah, just give it up. Perhaps what was presented in the first dialogue, une Europe mineure, a lesser Europe, you know, a fragile Europe. Maybe. But at the same time, you know, I think there is sunrise for Europe. And there are things that the old continent, like these old masters, can still do. Of course, I come back to the rape of Europa, which I said it was not a very good symbol for Europe. I myself have used it, turning it around. But in fact, the discussion of Europe is very often the discussion about old and new. Is Europe older or is Europe younger? Can it be renewed? Can it be given new youth? You may remember the Elia Kazan movie, America, America, in which young Greek wants to go to the US. And I did this issue a long time ago, called Europa, Europa. Explaining that perhaps this young Greek now wants to come to Europe, no longer going to America. I don't know whether this is true, but there I suggested a different symbol for Europe, Archimboldo. You see it there? Archimboldo, but Archimboldo the summer, not Archimboldo the winter. Because the identity and diversity is what Europe is about. And the Archimboldo images, you know, with the collection of fruits that compose a visage, a face, represent well the diversity of Europe. And I want to think that Europe cannot be summarized by the Archimboldo of winter on the right, but the Archimboldo of summer on the left. Of course, you may have recognized Ryan Koolhaas' building on the cover of the magazine, and of course this was the time in which Ryan Koolhaas produced the Corvat flag as a symbol of Europe. By that meaning, well, Europe in the end is a commercial thing, no more. Which we found it was very, very inappropriate. And he, at the same time that he produced this barcode Europe, he produced something else, which is Europe as a collection of trademarks. And that was the Europe that he believed in. As you can see, he lacked sort of imagination, and once he reached the Strait of Gibraltar, there were only architectural magazines, not big multinationals, but still. And of course, many of us did enter into debate with this perception, which Renkoll has expressed as the yes. You know, the yen, the euro, and the dollar. You know, globalization. And of course, he had taken it from an announcement by one investment fund. And somehow, it is the same tension that you find between a book by Naomi Klein, No Logo, about the power of the trademarks, and what the economists did, sort of answering it, pro logo, why brands are good for you. We were with Naomi Klein and against Renkoll and The Economist. And of course, by the same time, he produced the SML, which is not a collection of sizes. It is a defense of the large size, the XL. And of course, the XL, by that time, you see the XL capital was announced with an image of Calatrava in Valencia, and even Spain itself, the second transition, was in the same magazine, The Economist, expressed with Calatrava. And I felt unease with those things. So at the time, I showed my students this, which well, I suppose you know very well, which is at the same size, you have a pillar of St. Peter's, of Bramante, Michelangelo, Maderno, etc., and San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane by Borromini, so small that the Romans call it San Carlino, the small San Carlo, in which you can see that the church and the cloister, all of them could be fit into the pillar of St. Peter. This is simply to explain, of course, there can be good architecture of XL size, but also of very small dimensions. And we have had on this platform our friends of Ireland, the Grafton, and the Graftons have grown from small things to rather big things, and still we respect them. So they can be good architects working in different scales. And the same has happened with the two architects whom I mentioned before, you know, Norman Foster here in the exhibition, and David Chipperfield receiving in Athens the Pritzker, because, of course, yes, Norman Foster, the future, large scale, even going to the moon. And David Chipperfield, not only the very careful treatment of the past, but also, you know, huge works like the ones shown in this cover. But last week in the Athens event, after David's lecture, there was a debate between David and the two recipients of the Pritzker in the two previous editions. That you can see them here. Francis Queret and, of course, Anne Lacaton and Jean-Philippe Basal. And it was very interesting. For one thing, when you see Africa, I may overstate my case, but let me remember, speaking about my hero, Robert Schuman, that in the 3 pages of the Schuman Declaration, there is a mention of Africa, saying, Africa is the responsibility of Europe. Europe cannot turn its back to Africa. Our politicians have forgotten that. And this was written in a very short statement 73 years ago. In any case, of course, one of it is the responsibility to Africa with Francis Queret. The other one, of course, is Lacaton Basal, that I'm not going to discuss because you know them much better than I do. Of course, from the the square in Bordeaux to the remodeling of social housing, you know, it is the kind of architecture that is very easy to support because they are doing all the right things. But, and with this I'm going forward to the end, these opportunities of Europe are going to find many dangers ahead. I often write a short editorial in our magazine, Arquitectura Viva, in which I try to discuss some of them. For instance, in this case, you know, the social unrest produced by inequality with the Gilets jaunes here in France, or, you know, the challenge of China, which is such a different mindset than ours. Of course, climate change, which is something which all of us have to deal with in our private lives and in our professional lives. Contamination and pollution, both of the air and of the oceans. And even now, artificial intelligence, which again is a promise and also a menace. But none of these are as important or as urgent as the war in Europe. The war in Europe, of course, we dedicated the whole issue to when this happened last February of the last year, because it was a great shock. We didn't expect this. To be less dramatic, we use a Rothko painting, just turn around to echo the flag of Ukraine. And I presented it with a triptych, tribulation triptych, a triptych, because somehow I thought that it was such an important thing. Many years ago, the first time we dedicated a double issue was to September 11. And now, the first time I wrote 3 pieces of editorial was with Ukraine. One about the February tanks, that somehow we knew that it was going to happen. The ashes of March, and the awkwardness of Ukraine. With this I'm going to end, only with a triptych, another triptych. This other triptych is in the Prado, and you will recognize it immediately. Hieronymus Bosch, the Garden of Delights, but here with no characters. You know, José Manuel Ballester, a great photographer and artist from Spain, has taken out all the characters, has put new ones. And in it, many of the icons that we cherish of our culture are taking the place of the somehow shady and menacing images of Hieronymus Bosch triptych. And this, I promise, is my last image, in which I use the first image of the triptych without characters to present an issue about useful utopias, reasonable utopias, not, you know, shadowy perceptions, no, but things that we can really do and get. And with the other, you know, as a reference or as a contrast, this same landscape full of the fruits of European civilization. And let this child of Schumann to affirm that with the right leadership, Europe, which is a garden, can protect this garden of paradise, even correct the many things we have done wrongly in the past, and create new realities. But for that, we need our politicians to read the Schuman Declaration, go back to 1950, and start again, and build again with the same ideas that 73 years ago started to create this garden, which is Europe, and from we all benefit. Thank you.